Hey there, Warren.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. Let's hear these 3 questions that you got.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for introducing me to this new God. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
So my very first question actually relates to the God of Nebuchadnezzar at that time. So those of us that come from an atheist perspective, we really don't see that God any different than Nebuchadnezzar, kind of an egotistical, maniacal kind of, like you got to prove that I am the one. You have to bow. I'm going to kill my son, even my own son. And so that God isn't very different in my mind from Nebuchadnezzar, because they were told not to bow or to bow. And it actually seems like here is the God that created the whole universe and is so insecure that he has to have people bowing at command. I need some help.
So I think that you've really tapped into the tension of the story. And the fact is, there are stories of an angry God, both in the Old and the New Testament. And one thing that Christians often do, very uninformed biblically, is they'll say, like, God is angry in the Old Testament only. Read the book of Revelation.
I carefully avoided that.
So what I would say to that is, this story, in my opinion, is profound. And the Bible, just like humanity, is sometimes giant steps forward progressively and sometimes giant steps backwards regressively. What this story inspires me about is the fact that this is not a story about God who is with the king, who is the one dividing people into who will bow and who will not bow. God is with those who are persecuted, God is with those who are powerless, and God is in solidarity with those that the empire has run over. So this is then picked up on in the Christian tradition, and Jesus was obviously Jewish, so he was inspired by all this, to not stand in solidarity with King Herod, but instead to stand in solidarity with those who were poor and those who were steamrolled by the empire, which is very consistent with the story that's told in the fiery furnace. Now, I was raised in church school, and I was always told that thank God that Nebuchadnezzar switched to the right team, because this whole practice isn't what's wrong of like dividing those into who will bow and who will not bow. It's just he was asking them to bow to the wrong thing, which is not that inspiring of a story.
Yeah, thank you. Here's my second question. So we have a judicial system here in the United States that's very much based on this other kind of God, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You kill somebody, I'm going to kill you, sort of thing. So here's my question. So if we took the life of Jesus, what kind of judicial system would America have?
Yeah, so I'm going to quote Richard Rohr, which anytime I'm in trouble with a tough question, I quote Richard Rohr. He was the guy, he's a Franciscan friar, he lives in the desert. It's just very inspiring to me, I love his writings. He talks about the difference between redemptive violence and redemptive suffering. And redemptive violence is where God says, I will kill all the people who aren't allegiant to me. Redemptive suffering is when God says, I will stand in solidarity with anyone who is suffering. So when it comes to our judicial system, we in America have become obsessed with punishment. And we think that punishment is what brings about justice more than anything else. So much so that rehabilitation, even to talk about it for a criminal, is problematic, to say the least. To say, like, what's this person's life like after prison? Or how is this punishment helping them to become somebody better and transform in that way so that they are actually helpful to you and me, not just later on down the road, because they shouldn't have their whole life defined by this sentence. And our judicial system is based just entirely on that punishment system, instead of standing in solidarity with those who have been hurt, if they've even been affected by the person who's been affected by the crime. And while punishment is necessary in some cases, I think it should always be secondary to our questions of rehabilitation. And that's very much informed by the redemptive suffering of Jesus. And I think that it's standing in solidarity with those who are hurt.
Thank you. So here's my third and last question on mine. So these 3 gentlemen were on death row. They got this fiery furnace right there. And so everybody that's on death row has the privilege to having a chaplain say something to them. So my question to you, if you were there and these three gentlemen were on death row, what would you say to them?
Wow. So I have a mentor. Her name's Kim. She is the pastor, or she was the pastor of Lutheran Church. She retired in June of this year. And I asked her a similar question to that. She's someone who had a terminal illness and what she would say. And I took her advice to heart. She said, you don't say anything that you don't believe to be true. She's like, that you do not allow inauthenticity to rule that moment. It's much more important to be authentic and to be honest about things. And I truly believe that anyone who is on death row, whether they deserve to be there or not, is still in the presence of God. And so I would try to call them back to that as much as possible, to say that even in this, God is with you. And that is the promise of our faith. That is the promise of our tradition. And even if you feel like you are going away from God, even in all of this, God is with you.
Thank you.
So to let them know they're not alone more than anything else.
Thank you.
Great questions. Wow. All right, so let's turn to the other questions here from you guys.
So it says here, it's very scary to stand and enter the furnace. How do you do it?
Well, if you don't know, there are some instances I could tell you about where I don't know if furnace is quite the metaphor I would choose for me, but there are instances I feel like I've had to say the right thing. But even then, as a white cis-het male, you may be saying, like, he's really never faced a furnace in his life, and I would say I understand. Or I don't understand is a better way to say that. To that, though, I would say, usually you don't go looking for it. The opportunity just presents itself. And I think the most courageous people are the people who said, there's just no other option. Like, when they say, well, you could be silent, it's like, and not live? Like, what's the alternative to this? So I think that when you're in a moment where you're having to decide what is right and what's wrong, the prayer that I pray for is clarity and wisdom and trying to understand, is there other options here available? Because there are times you can de-escalate things, but the most courageous moments I have found consistently are when it's no other option. I'll tell you, like, some people have said some very kind things about us starting this church, and they've said, like, wow, it's really inspiring you did this. How is it you did it? It's like, there was no other option. Like, there was no other churches calling me. It was very clear that some people did not want me to go to other churches. And so it was like, well, I can do this or go back to school. And a group of people said, we can present this as an option, and it felt like the right thing to do. It didn't really feel courageous in the moment. It just felt like it was the only thing to do. So that's what I would say.
And it's pretty fiery.
All right, I see way to tie that around. I love it.
So I've tried and failed to be loving, especially to those who disagree with me politically. How can I be transformed?
Right? Did I send this one in? I feel like I sent this one in.
You've said it.
So there is this idea out there that gets a lot of clicks and views, that the more you hate the other side, the better you are being to your own side. Don't believe it. That's not who we are. And clicks and views are what's driving a lot of what we perceive to be reality right now. And there is something much deeper and much more important to us than that. I would say for something like this, it's hard. It's hard. I just want you to know before we go any further, this is hard. It's the hardest thing to do in Christianity is to love people who you disagree with and people who you would classify as enemies. One thing that has been helpful to me, and this is through gritted teeth, don't think it's easy for a pastor, I start saying the names of their children to remind myself that this is a mother or this is a father, this is a parent, and man, does it hurt. But at the same time, what else can you do? And I try to bring humanity back to the situation, and if I can see them as a human, I don't know if I've gotten to the point that I love them, but I can at least not have every waking moment be like, Ugh!
Maybe you can love them but not like them.
Yes, and I think it's really important for Christians to understand loving from a distance is a real thing, and I believe that Jesus would be supportive of that. You aren't called to have every person over your dinner because there are some people who will hurt you consistently. But I think that that's the thing you go back to, is that loving from a distance is a Christian way of love. And so what does that look like for you?
Thank you.
Good questions.
What is prophecy from Bible context?
Great question. So for that, we have to define what a prophet is. My definition of prophet is anyone who calls attention to pain that we would prefer to avoid and asks us to do something about it. That's who a prophet is. And there's this idea that prophets are fortune tellers. Those are called fortune tellers, my friends. Read the book of Jeremiah. If you finish, well done, I'm proud of you. But Jeremiah did not predict the future hardly at all. He just talked about people who were going through pain and asked the government to do something about it. And the government was annoyed with him because they didn't want to do something about those people's pains, right? So that's what a prophet is, which means a prophecy then is a vision for the future in which there is greater love. And so anytime anyone talks about a prophecy, specifically within a Christian context, I would say the purpose of prophecy is to remind us that no matter how scary tomorrow may seem, we can trust that Jesus will be there. Amen. And so if that's the true, and Jesus is asking us to love deeply, then we can trust that loving today will have its reward in the end, whatever that may be, whether it's an immediate reward or an eternal reward. Because that is the thing that lasts longer than any empire.
Thank you. So here's another one coming up.
How do you have left? It's your last one. Oh, last one. Great.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead. Read it.
Oh, here it is. I've heard it said that when people are oppressed in God's name, that God is on the side and at the side of the oppressed. Do you think that's true?
That's the entire basis of Christianity. The reason I know this is deeper than Christianity is the tradition of Judaism, of course. And Judaism has really about 80 years where things are working out great for them. And even in those 80 years, things aren't great. For instance, it's during the reigns of King David and King Solomon. And that's when they were powerful, they were rich, everything was going their way. But you read the authors closely, and this is why the Jewish texts are so profound, is they will expose why it wasn't that great to be rich and powerful. It's just, Christianity is not a group that was in power. It's hard for us to imagine right now, but the emperor didn't convert until the 4th century. All of these writings are from the 1st century. And if we could have Paul on this stage and say, like, Paul, what would happen if the emperor of Rome converted to Christianity? I think that Paul would say, that will never happen. And yet that's what happened. And the reason that's important to point out is because this was not a group of people who were trying to do political maneuvering to get their causes in place. This is a group of people who were pushed to the side over and over and over again, and were poor and were struggling to get by. And yet they kept saying, you know what I believe? I believe that he is risen. And that was the thing that kept them going, so much so that they wanted to pass it on to another generation and another generation. And they said, trust this. It's worth it. It will make you a more loving person. So much so that it was handed down to us in some way, shape, and form. And yes, has it been distorted? Of course it has. So has every religion ever. And so when you go back to those roots and you see Christianity not with centralized power, but on the fringes, that, in my opinion, is the most inspiring, because that's exactly who Jesus was. He was a Jewish person who lived on the fringes of society. He was not a person with power who could rule over others. So I am encouraging everyone here to trust the tradition and go to the fringes of power, go to the fringes of who is accepted in society, and start to say, whatever our tradition is, it promised us that if I go here, God will show up. So I'm going to go boldly and see where God is. Amen. So that's what I believe God of the oppressed needs. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to celebrate, and then we'll close with prayer. So we'll invite Darius, Denise, and Dina up, and then we'll sing a song of celebration as well. Thank you, Warren. Thank you to all of you.